I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we're going back to the very beginning.
In the way back machine.
We should make sure we throw this out on Throwback Thursday.
We should have a whole series of throwbacks. Like our outtakes series or something, you know? Like any famous artist has to have outtakes and B-sides, right? This could be our B-side.
What we're looking at today is the very, very beginning of Chinese literature.
Recorded literature,
right. But
collected literature.
Literature is necessarily recorded. We're not going to get into this conversation.
Like, what is literature, Lee? That's a conversation, for another time.
That's a conversation for a few beers.
Yeah.
We're looking today at the very first poem in the collection called the Shi Jing, the classic of poetry, classic of odes. It's translated as a variety of things. When we say the very beginning of Chinese literature, we mean it. There were a few things that we have existent that are written before this in some form of Chinese. But the Book of Odes, the poems were probably written around something like 600 BCE. We don't really know. They're a collection of poems, and supposedly some people claim they represent folk songs.
Right. They're typically sort of seen as adaptations of older songs, folk songs, that kind of thing. And the odes are also part of this, what we call the 5 books of Confucianism. And among those 5 books, one of the real common things that Confucius, or the scholars more accurately who are with Confucius, claim is that everything they're doing is unoriginal. They're just taking the wisdom of the ancients, the songs of the people, and they're just transmitting them. That's one of Confucius's famous sayings, is that I do not create, I transmit.
The traditional interpretation of this is that this is not an original poem. It's a transmission. We just really don't know, but I'm always kind of suspicious when I hear someone say something like that.
Whenever you have this pure, untapped link to the people, you should be suspicious. And we're going to get into a little bit of that later.
Yes.
Let's get into the poem. The poem, we're using the Stephen Owen collection, an anthology of Chinese literature. Stephen Owen being sort of the dean of translation of classical Chinese anything. Anyway, he translates the title of the poem as Fish Hawk. Lee does not like this title.
More traditionally, it's been translated as Osprey. Fish Hawk and Osprey are the same thing.
They're basically the same thing, yeah.
It begins, and I'm just going to read the first stanza of it. The osprey sings Guan Guan on the sandbar of the stream. Gentle maiden, pure and fair, fit for a prince. And it kind of goes on like that. It's 5 stanzas long. It's very simple kind of imagery of the osprey mixed with this sort of love poetry about a woman. Confucius said that when commenting on this poem, that this poem was delight without wantonness. I don't know.
Sexual indulgence, in other words. For him, it's a gesture of sort of simple joy. It doesn't necessarily have to be read as a quote unquote love poem.
But for millennia old poetry, there is a kind of not raunchiness. There's nothing raunchy about this poem, but it's fairly explicit in the actual text. It talks about wanting this woman, and it's talking about desires in a way that later on in Chinese literature in certain periods would be considered too risque.
Right. But it's interesting, though, because this one is a combination of some of the things you just said with the diction, at least the meter and diction in the English. I think Stephen Owen does a pretty good job preserving the meter and diction. I'm complimenting one of the great masters of Chinese literature. Good job, Steve. Anyway, but the English does a pretty good job of preserving this rhythm of whoever is the speaker sounds like they're just enjoying themselves and singing along a riverbank. That they don't have any...
There's got to be a glass of baijiu in his hand, too.
Could be, or just, depending on how lighthearted you want to be. Maybe he's got some tea or just some spring water or something. It's just a poem of enjoyment. We don't have any indication in the poem that this is going to necessarily get raunchy. This is someone who's noting how beautiful this maiden is, But there's scenes of nature. There's the calling of birds, the splashing of water.
He's not just noting how beautiful this woman is. He's also talking about his desire for this woman. So Confucius is obviously much more of an expert than I am.
Really?
Yeah. Sorry, I hate to burst your bubble there.
Why am I doing this podcast with you?
But I mean, the way I'm reading it, there is an element of desire, and he is talking about something that's explicitly sexual. He's using the language of desire, I guess I should say. Not explicitly sexual, but he is using the language of desire. Just to make this point, I'm going to read the third stanza. Wanting sought her, had her not. Waking, sleeping, thought of her. On and on, he thought of her. He tossed from one side to the other. So when I say he's talking about his own desire, he's tossing in bed. He is. There's something a little bit more than an innocent romance going on here.
And we would have to agree, especially the line about he tossed from one side to another in his sleep. So he's dreaming about it. There's a lot going on here. What's interesting though is, and this is a very common thing throughout Chinese poetry, even to the present day, is mixtures of natural imagery with either romantic or, if you like, sexual desire. Sometimes it's used as a commentary. It's not clear here what role the osprey actually plays. But one of the things that's nice, it is, we're reading this sort of as, not as professionals, but as people who sort of get paid to read this kind of stuff and talk about it. But it is possible simply to read it as a fairly lovely poem, like a spring poem. Some things that are common, I would say, in most cultures, right? There's attraction, love, there's nature waking up, there's a spring, there's water, there's things that a lot of cultures can understand, can relate to.
Yeah, the way I read this poem is that he's sitting there by a river and he's seeing the osprey and hearing the sound, and somehow the sound connects him to a memory of the woman, and it's taking him back. I hate to make the comparison, but there is an element of this that we can still see even in pop songs today.
Sure.
Right?
I was actually going to make that point a second ago, but this would be more like a pop song from like the 50s or 60s. Like, sexual attraction runs all through those two because of how old they are and the sort of circuitous language used. You just sort of sing along to it without thinking much about it.
So this is more the Coasters and less Miley Cyrus.
Exactly. Or other more explicit things. But yeah, there's so many, even the Beach Boys and fairly, simple
Wouldn't
groups.
Wouldn't it be nice if we...
Wow, that's awesome, Lee. You should sing more on the podcast or not. But there's sex runs all through popular music in the U.S. as well. This is one of the most common aspects of human life. So
to be fair, sex runs all throughout all popular music, I would say. It's essentially a genre organized around the love song.
Right. But let's shift this a little bit, because one of the most interesting things to me about both the poems in the Shijing, they're the odes, the
book of odes, the book of songs,
classic of poems. It's hard sometimes parsing the titles to these because they've been translated differently. Anyway, is this central claim of sort of access to the people, that they're just transmitting the songs of the people. And the reason this is interesting is because centuries and centuries later, Chairman Mao Zedong is making a strikingly similar claim. In some of his writings about art, especially at the Yan'an Conference in the 30s, he's saying, look, we got to get back to the people. They're the ones that really understand what art is. We got to go back to that.
And the art that comes out of that is, we've argued, garbage.
Right, but that's one of the things that's interesting. I haven't done any kind of long-term study on this, but what differentiates the two? Is it just sheer
Is it just that these are 2,500 years old, and in 2,500 years will the Maoist poetry
will seem like sheer genius? Because you listen to songs from the 50s now, they're classics, but in the 50s they weren't classics. No one was listening to the Beach Boys or Jan and Dean and going, "Wow, Rob, this is a timeless classic."
If I could suggest, it seems like you're almost channeling your inner Proust, in that Proust asked the same question. Is it only because of habit that something becomes a classic? Is it only because of habit that we get used to hearing something or hearing a song that we start to recognize its essence and its essentialness?
In both cases, is it a case of who actually gets a hold of the reins of power? Because the scholars that have various titles in Chinese history, but the scholars gathered around the purported writings of Confucius anyway, eventually sort of get privileged access to the courts of power and help to weed out anything that's not one of these 5 books. These are the 5 books that everyone must read, right? Yeah. So during the Maoist era in China, it was something similar, right? You couldn't just go out and say, well, I'm tired of reading Mao Dun. I'm going to go ahead and get some.
There was very much, during the Maoist era, there was very much a limit on what artistic works you could access. And if you did try and access older artistic works, you could very well be killed. And that's not an exaggeration at all. Lots of people were killed for having some of the Ming and Qing dynasty novels in their house. And I think that your point is well made. I'm not entirely sure how relevant it is, but at the very least, I think we should be suspicious of any claim by the compilers. And no, we're not talking about authors because we have no idea who the authors are. We vaguely know kind of some things about the compilers. Supposedly Confucius was the editor of the Shi Jing, which makes it a work doubly important. Not only is it the earliest work of poetry we have extant in Chinese literature, but also it's supposedly, and this is just legend, we don't really know anything about this, but it's edited by Confucius. Right. And so the placement of this poem at the front of this anthology has been interpreted to mean that Confucius thought this was the worthiest of worthies.
Which that's a pretty high claim.
That is, coming from Confucius.
Right. And it's interesting, though, that every major movement, it seems, in Chinese literature has some claim to have a voice of the people, right? May 4th did this. We're going to write true vernacular literature. Mm-hmm. Confucius does this with the odes. Mao does this later on. There's always this attempt to sort of connect, quote unquote, with the ordinary common people, and to presume to not even add one's own artistic embellishments. This is the people. This is themselves. But it's hard to imagine farmers in a field singing with the kind of fairly sophisticated poetic diction that you get in the odes.
And keep in mind, literacy was so limited at this time that it's impossible for us to believe that farmers were writing any of this down. Even royals oftentimes were not literate. It was only scribes in the court who were literate at this time. I may be exaggerating that a bit. This literacy is there is a very narrow population of literate scholars at this time. So this is being written down and at least filtered through some very highly educated scribes.
But what's interesting ultimately, I think, to me, and this is where I'm going to start wrapping it up, is even with all of that, even with centuries, if not millennia of difference, even the fact that we're reading it in translation, it's a lovely poem. That's remarkable. Yeah. And even, it's I make all these comments about sort of appropriating the voice of the people. Even when doing that, it's still possible to do something that, A, is truly beautiful, and B, that the people actually kind of like. It's a little bit like Creedence Clearwater Revival. They didn't actually come from the Bayou, but they were so freaking good that even people in the Bayou were like, remember a good buddy of ours who comes from the Bayou talks about having been crushed when he realized Creedence Clearwater Revival wasn't actually from somewhere in the Delta down there.
One final thought I have is that I want to point out this is not only the first work of quote-unquote Chinese literature, it's also a very, very influential work down through the ages. People are reading this again and again, and it becomes incorporated in all kinds of literary works. The thing that jumps to my mind is that the reading of this poem is the inciting event in Mudanting, the peony pavilion, which is the greatest of the late imperial dramas. I think it's written in the Ming. So this work is a work of not only important. It's not only important because it's the first, but it's important because it keeps being important and it keeps being influential. And I think that's what sticks with me about this poem.
It ages very, very well. And that's a pretty impressive thing for a poem this old.
Just like, I mean, we've had so many references to mid-century pop singers. It ages like the Beatles. It gets better and better.
Except I don't really like the Beatles very much.
Yeah, that's your problem.
Yeah.
Anyways, I think we can't really shove in any more references to pop music in this podcast.
Oh, we probably could. I just think people would tune us out eventually.
So we should probably wrap it up. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.